right, I'm excited to be here. I'm kind of bummed. It's the last day of ng-conf. I mean, that means Monday we go back to real life. I know, exactly, right? All right, so we're going to talk about scenarios where how many have a component at a deeper level, a component at a higher, like way higher level, and you have to talk. Or how many have a dashboard scenario, and you have siblings, they don't know about each other, but you have to talk. All right, this comes up a lot. State management is one option here that you could do, but we're going to talk about one that I think is a lot easier and sometimes more applicable. It just really depends on your scenario. We're going to talk about mastering the subject. All right, so first off, let's talk about kind of the problem here. We're going to say that given that we have a space theme, you've actually been stationed remotely, but on the moon. And I don't know how your git commits are going to be there. That might be a little questionable, but we're going to have some git commits maybe that run, and we'll have our ng-conf code fly down. But rather, if you're on Earth or Mars or wherever, you're still going to have this state management problem, or this communication, I'm going to call it, problem. More of a messaging problem. So what we're going to talk about here is how do components communicate when they don't actually know about each other. So for example, you might have this type of scenario here where we're doing a container presentation pattern. We have a more deeply nested, we'll say, component. Who knows where it is in the overall structure of the screen. And now I need that component to somehow notify the nav bar up here that something's about to change. Well, one way we could handle this is probably not the best way, but we could do an output event to an output event to an input, and that could go really crazy. Anybody done this before? You have output to an output to an output, and you're just like, there's got to be a better way, right, to do this. And you can, and that's kind of what we're going to talk about here. So moving along, if we could do an input to that, that's great, but do I really need the app component to be involved? Probably not, I'm going to argue. And we probably don't want that type of scenario. Now, another scenario is, what if you have a service, and when something changes there, you want to message parts of your app? What could you do there? Well, again, you potentially could use a state management solution, but I'm going to argue that's not appropriate unless you need to store some state in the actual data store that we may have. So what we're going to talk about is a different approach that you can actually take here. And we're going to talk about RxJS subjects, or mastering the subject, if you will. All right, so first off, you've now been promoted. You get to go to the good old Mars now. We'll hope Tesla or one of the Blue Origin or one of those other things have come up with a solution there for this. I think your git commits get a little slower, so you're going to have more time for coffee, I suspect. But you still have this communication problem. I can't help you with the satellite part, but I can help you with the Angular part on services or components. So we're going to talk about four main subjects here. The first one is just called subject, and we'll talk about what that is. We're going to talk about behavior subject a little bit here. And then we're also going to talk about replay subject. And finally, we're going to briefly get into async subject. Now, some of you have probably used these before. Some of you probably haven't. I'm going to especially speak to those that haven't in this initial part, and then we're going to talk about some patterns we could follow. So subject, this is a way that I have some data, and we call it the subject. And I would like all of you potentially to be able to subscribe to the data, but you're only going to get the data after you subscribed. So anything that happened before you hooked up, it's not going to matter. You won't get it. So it kind of looks like this. We have component A, we have component B, and let's say component A has subscribed. Well, what will happen is data flows in like you would expect from the subject. Now, this subject could be in a service, for example, which is what we're going to look at. Now, let's say component B subscribes a little bit later. Well, they're not going to get the previous data, of course, because with the subject, you only get the data after you subscribe. And that's kind of how it works. All right, so that's the first one. Now, the next one we're going to look at is a behavior subject. So what if you've subscribed, and you're cool with getting the data that comes in the future, but you also want data that, maybe the last piece of data that went out to everyone. Okay, very, very useful. Maybe some customers or invoices have already been shown somewhere else. You would like to just automatically get that data. Well, we can do that with a behavior subject. So a behavior subject looks like this. We're going to subscribe. Now, multiple pieces of data might flow down to component A here that you see. Now, component B eventually subscribes. Let's say it's 2 minutes later. This component now comes on the screen through some mechanism. They now need the last piece of data that was sent to component A or any others. So what we're going to do there is subscribe, and now with behavior subject, you'll first off get that last piece of data, and then any future pieces of data. All right, so very useful. This is my favorite one. This is the one I use the most, actually. All right, now the next one up is actually a type of behavior subject, but more specialized. In fact, behavior subject, kind of in sheep's clothing, is replay. This is where multiple pieces of data have gone out, and now you want to get to that data, all right, and work with it. So you want to replay kind of either everything or maybe just a subset of what happened. You can control that with a replay subject. So with a replay subject, it would look like this. Several pieces of data now are going to come out to component A. So we'll let those kind of flow down here. All right, there we go. Now component B is going to subscribe, and what they're going to get is everything that's happened, in this case, plus any future data. So this is a great way that if you have some components down here and up here something changed, you want to catch these up because they just loaded. Maybe they loaded through like a lazy loaded route or something like that. Then we could take care of this and replay all the data up to that point. Now, really, as I mentioned, this is a behavior subject, but it's a more specialized. The behavior subject uses this, we could say. Just replays one, whereas this could replay whatever you tell it to replay. Okay, now the last one is, what if you have a stream of data, but you only care about the last value in the stream? You want the one that was emitted last, the freshest, you could say, data. Well, we can do that with an async subject. And so I'm going to kind of simulate some data going. It's just going to go off into la-la land here. So let me go ahead and subscribe. And now the data that we're going to kind of pretend is now flowing somewhere. But when the last piece of data comes, which will be the 3 in this case, you'll get that, and then that means the async subject has completed. All right, it's done. So this would be, I just want the last piece. Now, I personally don't use this one as much, but it totally depends on the scenario, and that's kind of why we're going through these. There's not a right or wrong way. There's a right tool for the right job way that you'd want to do. All right, so before we move on to this, let me show you an example just really quickly, and I'll have a link at the end for the code here. All right, let me go full screen here. So you're going to see a subject, a behavior subject, a replay, and an async. And what's going to happen is when I hit the start button here, the subject is going to wait a second or two, and then it's going to start. We're going to subscribe. Okay, now the others are not going yet. So you're going to see the behavior subject then goes a few seconds later. Then the replay subject follows that a little bit later. So I just have a little timer going. And then finally, the async subject is going to wait till that stream completes, and you'll get the last value. So let me show you kind of what it would look like here. So when we start it, you'll notice the subject service is now started. Now the subject's going to start getting data there. Okay, and you'll just see some numbers kind of flowing in. Now the behavior subject just launched. Notice it immediately got the last one that was emitted. Okay, very cool. You get that last item. Now replay subject got everything, and then finally async subject just completed. Now the others will just keep going from here on out, whereas replay subject, you're done. You got that last, or I'm sorry, async subject, you're done. You got that last value. And that's kind of what these would look like. Now we'll come back to this in just a bit here. But let's talk about some of these other techniques we could do now to make this work. So now that we've talked about the subjects, what do you do with the subjects? Well, you might have heard of service with a subject, or subject service, or however you want to call it. We're going to talk about some different communication techniques where we can use these to do something, whatever that may be, to send a message. So for example, we would like to send some data up. Well, I'm going to talk about an event bus and how you could use that and the pros and cons. We're also going to talk about an observable service, pros and cons. We'll kind of go that route. Now, the event bus could also be used for the dashboard scenario. Does anybody have a dashboard where you never know what widgets are going to be on there? but sometimes they have to communicate with each other. Pretty common, right, when the user can pick whatever it is they want to pick for the widgets. Well, we can do that with this event bus. So an event bus would be great for scenarios where component A, component B, component Z, they have no idea about each other. Right? Very loosely coupled. And I'm going to send events around, messages around, so that we can communicate. And I want to emphasize again that, if you say, well, yeah, Dan, but I need to store the message in like a state store. Okay, well, then you can probably go with one of your state store options. This is more for I just need the message, but I don't need to store the data in the store. Okay? And this is what we call the mediator pattern. It's typically what we call a middleman pattern, man in the middle. All right, now we could also have another one we're going to talk about called an observable service. Now, this would be good. Maybe you have an inventory service, and let's say you have WebSockets pushing data into it. Well, how do you know when the data comes into the service if you're these components? Let's say over here, you're the components that need to subscribe to the service way over here. How do you know? Well, we can use subjects to do this. We're going to go through these in just a sec here. So first off, let's talk about the event bus. Now, this is a very loosely coupled way to communicate, and there's pros and cons to this. I don't think it's appropriate for every scenario, but I think there are some scenarios where it works great. So first off, we can create an event bus. Thanks to John Papa for the fabulous animation, by the way. He's pretty good at some of that stuff. So we can create an event bus here, and this is going to define a subject. Now, subject, remember, you only get the data after you subscribe. All right, now the difference here is I don't want to just send out any data. I want to do it event-based. I have a customer selected, inventory changed, order deleted, whatever it is that you want to do. Well, the first thing I'm going to do is we could define an emit, and I just made this name up. You can call it whatever you want, of course. And what I'm going to do is this is how we would send data using the subject. Now, notice, though, I'm passing an event, emit event. I'm going to show you that next slide or two here. It's a very simple class I wrote that takes an event name, and it takes the data. So you could have a customer selected, order deleted, whatever it may be. All right, so that next is going to be really, really important here as we work with this. Now, of course, we also need, this handles maybe this crowd over here wants to send data, but you over here, you want to receive data, right? The event bus is just in the middle here. So the way we can do that is through something like this. Now, this is kind of cool because you can use RxJS here to say, all right, I'm going to pipe the subject here, and whatever event is passed in the on that you see. Now, there's different ways you could pass the event here. I chose an enum. Does anybody prefer magic strings? If you do, we need to have a talk. But you could use whatever you want. But I chose an enum just so I don't have typos, because I'm pretty good at typos. So this on here, what it's going to do is you'll pass me the event you want to subscribe to, and I'm going to filter down based on that event name to any that are emitted, the top one, out of the subject. All right, pretty cool. Now, this is where you need to make a decision. Notice I'm actually subscribing here. Okay, the reason is that if you're sending data, you're receiving data, you don't have to over here do anything except for say on customer selected, which I'll show you next, give me the data. All you have to do is unsubscribe. That's it. You don't have to do a subscribe and pipe stuff. But you may say, nah, I don't want to do that. I'm just going to return the actual observable itself. I'm going to make them subscribe. That would be an option. This is to keep it extremely simple, though, on both sides. So to send data using the event bus, we're going to do something like this. We're going to inject it first off. Typical Angular way to do it. And then notice down in our code here and select customer. See that events.customer selected? Well, there's my enum, but again, if you're a magic string person, go for it. But I'm going to say I only want to emit data for customer selected, and then here's my data. So I'm using that event bus to emit, you can see. Now, on the other side, so that'd be, we'll say you over here. Now, for the people over here, you need a way to subscribe to through the event bus in a loosely coupled way, because you don't even know them, by the way. You're just magically getting this data. Well, we can do that by injecting it, and then notice in my ng on init, I'm going to say, hey, event bus on this event, get me the data, and do something with it, whatever that is. Now, that'd be, of course, up to you. Now, the big thing here is you do get a subscription returned. I prefer to use something which John talked about this on Wednesday, called Subsync from our good buddy Ward Bell. Super easy, super lightweight. And this will let me easily subscribe or unsubscribe from multiple observables. And there's different ways you can use it. I chose to use the sync property. Okay, so that kind of covers you can emit, you can subscribe, but you could over here have as many events as you want, and over here you can now filter down to I only want customer selected, order completed, inventory added, whatever it is. Now, that sounds pretty cool on the surface, but has anybody done an app like this where they maybe abused this concept? You had like 10,000 events, and you never know where data is coming from. All right, so there's pros and cons to this. It's very loosely coupled. That works awesome. But you also need to keep in mind that unless you added data here, that instead of just getting the customer, maybe you also get info about the sender, then you could do that too. Now, that would be an option, but still, you got to keep that in mind from a maintenance standpoint, in my opinion. All right, now the last main one we're going to cover is an observable service. Now, the difference here is with an event bus, I want someone over here to communicate with someone over here, but you never meet. Right? It's very, very loosely coupled. With the observable service, what we're going to do is I have a service like an inventory service, we'll say, or a customer service. And when data changes in that, I'd like to notify other parts of my app. Now, this again would be one of those cases where you have to evaluate, is this data I want to store? Okay, in that case, you might go with NGRX data. I use something called Observable Store, whatever it may be. But if you just want to send messages, but you don't care about storing the data, then this is a great way to go. It's very simple. All right, so let's jump in. So first off, you notice up top, I've defined a behavior subject. Why? Well, because if you subscribe to this, which I'll show you in a moment, you want to get the last piece of data we're assuming. So if you missed out on the previous minute of data and only one thing was sent, you'll be able to get to it. Super cool. Now, notice I'm not exposing the subject, though, directly. I'm calling as observable here. Okay, if you expose the subject directly, which you could do, by the way, and it would work, whoever subscribes or hooks into this, well, guess what they have to do? They have to know the whole subject API. They're going to get kind of overwhelmed by stuff they don't need, and they could start emitting things. Not a good idea, because now you're really confused on where data is coming from in your application. Now, finally, we do exactly what you saw earlier. We're now going to take our subject, and we're going to call next on it, and that's going to send out our product. Very simple. Now, the difference here between the event bus is you're going to see we're going to inject this, and we're going to subscribe to it. So this not only sends the data, but it's also the source of the message, wherever that message came from. All right, so very, very simple, though. Just a few lines of code, you can get something like this going, and now you have to choose. Do I want subject? Do I want async subject, replay subject, whatever it is. Whatever's best for your particular scenario. All right, so moving on here. Let's wrap up this part, and how do you subscribe? Well, this is just back to normal. Anyone who's subscribed to HTTP client or something like that could do it. Now we would inject the inventory service into our target. It could be another service, it could be a component. It's totally up to you on what you'd like to do there. And then we simply subscribe to that inventory changed observable, and we get the data. And if, in this case, if you'd prefer to use like the async pipe, that'd be an option as well. I'm kind of showing the unsubscribe part, but you get the idea here. And I would, of course, have to have subsync up top. Couldn't fit it on the slide. All right, so those are two patterns that you can follow. So let's review here real quick. So subjects allow us to send data anywhere in our app. Doesn't matter how deep, how shallow, we can send data anywhere. You just need to pick the appropriate subject. And then we just discussed two patterns that you could actually use to make this happen. All right, I'm telling you, if you haven't done this before, it's immensely powerful and super simple. So if you feel like you're overwhelmed by complexity right now with whatever scenario, it's a very simple way, using one of these patterns, to actually go in and get data from point A to point B, no matter how deeply nested. Now, I want to go back to if you're using inputs and outputs, where appropriate, this doesn't replace that, of course. Okay, but if you have a really deep hierarchy or components that are at different levels, then you want to be really careful about input, 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 or output, 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 whatever it is. All right, now I have like 2 seconds left, so I'm going to mention one more thing here, actually, a little bonus content. I didn't know if I'd have time to cover it, but, oh, no, we're not. Nice. I'm going to mention that PowerPoint decided to crash. Let me see real quick if I can open that back up. And we'll just jump to it real quick here. All right, gotta love it. All right, so let's go to here. So this is actually taking this to a final level. If you not only want to do what we just talked about, but you also want a store, you want state management, you can do that. And it's very simple to do. This is actually what I use, and a lot of the companies now that I work with are using this. So it's called Observable Store. It's a very simple project that allows you to leverage subjects, but it has a store behind the scenes to set and get state, and it tracks history of the state changes, and you can log that out and do all kinds of fun stuff. So if you're interested, you can read more about it. I'll give you a link here. My clicker seems to have a range issue. I don't know if you've noticed, but this is the main goals of it. Single source of truth, immutable data, change notifications of the store, track state history, all the stuff you normally want with state management, very simple. And this kind of shows what you do. You just use services. And then you can extend an Observable Store, and guess what's in that Observable Store? Subjects. They were using subjects, actually. So more info there if you're interested. Well, now I am officially out of time, so thank you so much for listening, and good luck with mastering the subject.